So, if you think you're not a typical INFP, today I'm bringing Dr. Dario Nardi in to share his research and findings about how our personality type can fit into a bunch of different variations that are really important to help you understand yourself at a deeper level, as well as understand why you might not feel like you fit into the common descriptions of that personality type. So, thank you for coming, Dr. Dario Nardi.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for having me again. And I feel like virtually, even though we're thousands of miles away, that it's a little bit of a return to Japan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
anytime.
Hey, arigato.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where shall we start?
I think it would be helpful for most INFPs that are just watching this now to get like a base understanding of the INFP personality type based off your research. And then maybe we can talk about a little bit of, the function stack and some of your findings and how that might be shaped differently based off, environment and personal development and gender and those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Yeah. So a fair number of people now, I guess, have become familiar with my neuroscience research, and um, we're actually not going to discuss so much of that today, although we can. That there's another project which I've been working on at the same time as the neuroscience over all these years. And I have to thank fellow type enthusiast INTJ, Dr. Mina Barmani, for leading all the statistical analysis and a much more conventional, like psychometric analysis of things. And what do we find? INFP is a discrete category. Introverted feeling is a discrete category, but there is development that's a very big part of it. And in Psychological Types, Jung's book, he talked about 8 functions, and only in the last page and a half did he talk about anything beyond that. He didn't actually propose 16 types or something like that. He strongly alludes to it, so we see where he gets it from. But why would there just be like 16 exact sets of stacks that are exactly a certain way? And by stack, we mean like the order of the functions. And the psychometric analysis of the CPA, the cognitive processes assessment, which we're now doing a second round of with over 200,000 respondents, that shows that there's I want to say like a classic INFP, which is probably where type description come from. And then there is the variant or adapted or alternative. Like we don't have a word for it yet. We'll just call it variant INFP. And that isn't some discrete different stack. That's just like anything goes almost, depending upon what shows up in the person's life. And it makes sense because we're all social creatures. We're all cultural creatures. I've said this multiple times over the last few years. If we want to talk about type, we need to talk about development. That's type superpower. Something like 5-factor model can't talk at all about development. Has nothing to say. And so what are sort of the exciting results of it? And I think it can be really helpful for people who feel like, oh, I don't fit in the standard box. And that's sometimes, how type is used, is these boxes, and to be able to just go beyond that and allow people to really see that their lives can be very rich and different, and their developmental path can lead them to develop some functions that or express those that maybe they normally wouldn't have for their type, but they're still clearly their type, and they're not dysfunctional or something. I think that can happen, but that's a small minority. Yeah. And there's certainly some people who are like the classic stack and quite dysfunctional. So,
We can all be
we just got
dysfunctional. It's okay.
It's okay. All of us are sometimes dysfunctional. I think that's fair to say, whatever that means. But yeah, that's sort of the crux of it, is talking about the psychometric results and seeing that on the one hand, they support Jung. They don't necessarily support the stack or MBTI. But they ask us to like really just think organically for each person, that when they get their like profile of 8 function use, how skilled are you? How often do you use these in a skillful way? that people have to develop stuff. I mean, people work in big organizations, and INFPs do, and I've met INFP executives. They have to develop TE sooner than would be expected. They're ones who grow up in cultures or social class or whatever where extroverted sensing is encouraged. And so is that like their favorite function? No.
Right.
But it's like way higher in the stack than we would expect. And yeah, so I just want to, the saying for a long time, for decades in type, is it's for ENFPs, but we can adapt it for INFPs. Is every INFP is like every other INFP, is like some other INFPs, is like no other INFP. And we're going to talk about the like some other and like no other.
Cool. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be really helpful because just recently, I know we're not going into the neuroscience much or anything, but we've been talking about the 4 different types within this. And I think a lot of INFPs who have been watching have been like, oh, finally, like it makes sense that I fit into more of this style than this style. And I think that brings a lot of solace and self-understanding and self-acceptance. And I think what you're going to talk about today, from my understanding, is going to also loosen that up a bit and say it's okay that maybe you have more developed TE or NI or some FE or something like that. And that is okay. And actually, you can use that as a strength and you can lean into that more. And also, as you mentioned before we started the call, there's a difference between preference and development that might be something interesting that we can expand on as well. So
yeah, and it's a little bit premature to add, but for those listeners who follow Dr. John Beebe, the Jungian analyst, and how he talks about the functions play certain roles, I define them slightly differently. Like, I emphasize different things. I don't disagree with him. I just emphasize different things. I believe that even though the function stack could be different for each person, those functions are still playing the same roles, which makes sense because, like, in certain environments, whether it's your job or your upbringing, your gender role, that certain like roles have to come to the fore. And that's okay. And I don't believe that, like, oh, if it's in like the lower part of the stack, in theory, that means it's dysfunctional or shadowy and bad. And no, they all have like great, like, positive sides as well.
Awesome. Yeah, as you know, and a lot of the viewers on this channel will probably know, is that I personify each of the cognitive functions and treat them as parts. And I always think like, well, if you just work on your relationship with that part of yourself, or maybe that cognitive function, if you want to think about it that way, then you're going to have a different relationship with it. You're going to be able to use some of the skills of that a bit better, or in different dynamics, and maybe clear up some of the negative baggage around, say, TI or something like that. So it's not as maybe detrimental or not as much of a shadowy focus. And I think that can be really helpful just in general. Once I learned to appreciate TE as a part of myself, then my relationship with other people got better who were like ETJs. And then my daily progress and achievements and stuff like that throughout my life improved as well. So
Yeah, very good.
cool.
So we could start with what items in the assessment. So the whole assessment has 48 items, and 32 of them are pure function questions where you just rate on a scale, like, independently. And out of those, we found the ones that perform the best statistically, and that boils down to like 24 questions, which means 3 questions for FI. And what do those questions then say? Like, over, I don't even remember how many FI folks there are in it, people who scored FI first, but like, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. So it really is a tremendous amount of data. How does FI actually like show up in terms of what is supportable statistically? And there's like 3 things that come up for FI as INFP's dominant function. And one of them is what I want to say, like, integrity of desire, like staying true to your inner values for yourself, and also keeping the potentially, what's good for others in mind also. but having integrity with that. And that was something that popped out. The second thing was belief prioritization, like judging the importance based on your identity and the meaning of things and what's of value to you. So integrity of desire, belief prioritization. And then the third is what we could sort of call like self-motivation awareness.
Okay.
Like what are my personal values? What's goodness? And like, how do I stay in tune with those? How do I stay in touch with those?
Mm.
Like, how do I know what I like? And believe it or not, there are types that they're like, well, I look to other people to find out what I like. And that's not introverted feeling. That's not
No.
INFP.
Yeah.
I mean, that they might gather some information about what's going on with other people, but it's staying in tune with that. So there was there were no surprises in terms of the analysis of the 8 functions. Like the 8 functions came out truly as 8 distinct categories
Mhm.
that are statistically significant, that holds together, and that what holds together really sounds like FI or NI or TE or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And that's, in fact, a little bit of a surprise for me was that extroverted thinking in particular really is externally focused, like thinking based on what is the evidence right in front of us.
Mhm.
And that's like as like an outside piece of evidence. And the actual like logical thinking part is just like thinking in general, in a very general way. And there's
Mhm.
also feeling in general. I mean, there are some INFPs who are much more, I'm going to say, like socially aware and concerned about the well-being, the welfare of other people.
Mhm.
And then there's some INFPs who are just like, it's me, my, mine, I.
Yeah.
And that's also something we see in the data. But that's like the feeling of that's what came out as like, if we're going to talk about introverted feeling to academic people and say what can be justified, that is what how we would define FI.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. I smiled on each of those 3 descriptions. I was like, yes, that's that. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and as you mentioned also about the 2 different kind of like me, my, I, or I don't know, remember how you worded it, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, I was thinking just yesterday, like I've put myself in situations where I didn't even consider the other person, but once I like took a moment and let that go in, and I reflected internally of like how would I feel if I were in that situation,
Mhm.
then it opens up a bunch of, uh, you know, empathy or sympathy and the ability to interact with that other person in a different way. But it needs to
Mhm.
like, I don't think seep in is the correct word, but like it needs to be generated from within for me to be able to deal with it in the external world in terms of feelings and things like that. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
but that's where my mind went when you explained that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's and the fact that they're multifaceted, I know sometimes people want to have like a one-line definition of each
Yeah.
function
Or 3 words.
and or 3 words or whatever it is. And those can be like like the starter pack for the function. Like
Hmm.
how do I get started to understand it? Um, but I think it's important for people to remember that as Peter Geyer in Australia, who is a like type historian, um, talks about, he's like, Jung in many ways conceived of the 8 function model as a mandala, and that
Hmm.
it's not supposed to be formal definitions, because the moment we give like a formal final definition, we limit what it means, not just the function, but we limit what it means to be human.
Hmm.
And really the function model is meant to be not just a broad tool, but something to meditate on, to reflect upon, and that over the course of a person's life, they can continue to enrich and further deepen understand their own dominant function.
Hmm.
That in addition to the other functions, that it isn't like, oh, you develop your dominant function and by age 6 or 7 it's set, and then you just have all this magical skill with it. And like, no, I keep learning stuff about my own dominant function as the
Hmm.
years go by. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. I always say that if we knew everything about ourselves and we knew exactly what to do and everything was just crystal clear, we wouldn't enjoy it anyway. Especially as
No.
INFPs, like we love the desire and the ability to delve deeper into who we are and who we could become and all these different facets of ourselves. And I know other types do that too, but specifically INFPs, like it just comes up all the time. So
Yeah, yeah, and it's part of the types, I think, themes or central theme or superpower, if we're gonna use that term, that it's the ability to keep returning to rediscover more about the core of oneself.
mhm.
And if the person is in a parent role or a therapist role or something like that, they're also helping other people do that, or like novelist role or whatever it is. Um, and boy, I could go on such a tangent about that. Um, no, you know what? I will, and I'm gonna do it
Sure.
for 1 or 2 minutes just because this overlaps with what you do too. So I'm playing the Lord of the Rings, D&D 5th edition game,
Nice.
and I really set out to play an ESFP, which is my opposite type. And Lord of the Rings, that whole world, which most of the people have seen at least one of the movies or something, know that it's very gritty and that magic is something dangerous and special and potentially corrupting. And that really it all boils down to the like choices that people make and the relationships that they keep and so the setting I have to congratulate the creators of it that they really drive it in that direction
Mm,
and that the moral choices that my ESFP character has had to make and then reflecting upon that and of course because he's ESFP so introverted feeling is second there's always still that like, oh, but we can go and charge out again,
uh,
and see what happens. Um, but yeah, it's this continual process of life tests us in different ways, and we're invited to examine our lives and ourselves, and that's I think the real beauty of type that
mm,
in addition to like, oh, we're going to talk about development or something. It's like just still that just, what is life about? And the ability for introverted feeling to help the person keep getting ever deeper in touch with themselves.
mhm.
Even if that's very painful, or if the person has a whole bunch of emotional baggage that's actually misleading, that, whatever the obstacles are to make that happen, but that's a drive that's there.
Yes, it is. Definitely. Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about games and role play and stuff like that, which we can maybe do in another video. But so what's next? You talked about the basic understanding of FI.
Mhm.
Um, should we talk about the other functions that are relevant to INFPs, or should we
Yeah.
break down FI? Okay.
I think let's talk about the other functions, and along the way, we're gonna get into some FI. So, what the assessment produces is like a little table or graph chart. I don't know what the difference really is between those three things. Um, that it shows how much you are using each function skillfully, and that's the instructions. It's not about preference in that assessment. It's about how much do you use each function skillfully. And we would expect that people would come out, let's say they have FI as the top, clearly, like they scored that, everything they scored very high. What about all of the others? Like, do people come out in this very predictable way that follows like a theoretical model?
Mhm.
Yeah, there are people who score like that, like they are a percentage, and there's a lot of people who don't. Um, and also to keep in mind that there's another type, ISFP, that also has introverted feeling as their top function, and
Mhm.
they also show up too.
Mhm.
And to give very broadly for each of the 8 functions, when we look at what are the what are called classes and statistics that come out of it, what are the statistical clusters?
Mhm.
That for every one of the functions, there are 4 statistical clusters. And for FI, I mean, it's 2 clusters that when you look at them, you're like, oh, well, these are clearly 2 different kinds of ISFPs. And then the other 2 of the 4 are, yeah, these are 2 different clusters of INFPs.
Okay.
And to me, that's really interesting that always one of them, and let's just say we're just going to talk about INFP, that one of those clusters is pretty standard for its type. Like, this is what we're expecting to see, where like feeling and intuiting generally are quite strong, and sensing and thinking are like much further down. That introverted thinking, which is supposedly their last function, is in fact the last function.
Mhm.
But then there's the other class, the other category, which is also pretty big. In fact, for this particular group, it's bigger.
Oh.
Like, there's a lot of INFPs who don't fit the like standard stack in terms of skillful use.
Mhm.
And how it is that there's sort of like a standard INFP, which we know is going to be reflective and imaginative, and we can attach some other, adjectives to it. And then there's a version of INFP that is quite common statistically, which is simply more social and more expressive. And we've met these people before. And
Mhm.
this is what I loved, is I went through all of the data for all of the functions, including for INTJs. There was a result, one class of INTJ. I'm like, yeah, I know that INTJ. I'm not that, but I know those folks.
Mhm.
And they're the ones that are like the standard profile that we expect. And so an interesting question then comes, it's like, well, why? Like, oh, but don't we want everybody to fit into these nice little stacks and like prove the theory and everything? And I'm like, no, not really. I mean, it's sort of what you said, like it would be boring, but all the genetics research that's out there, genetics and personality, like the Minnesota twins study on identical twins raised separately, says that each of the personality dimensions for MBTI, 5-factor, multiple assessments that they used, 40 to 60% is inherited. And maybe that is where the push for the standard stack of functions, the standard development, comes from, maybe. And then the other 60 to 40% is environment,
Mhm.
which means that the person's upbringing, their culture, where they went, how they did school, gender roles and expectations for people, their career training, but also just the daily practice of years and years. Even the theory predicts type development. I mean, an INFP who's age 70, I would be a little bit concerned if they scored the same way as an INFP who's 17.
Definitely.
And I'm certainly not the person. I was very standard INTJ at age, they say 15 or 20. And I was introduced to type, I think, at age 21 or no, 22 and 23. And I was really quite standard INTJ. And by the time I got to now, let's just jump to now, that I wouldn't score that way.
Mhm.
And but I, from 25 onward, I just made choices in life that like, I'm not going to be that kind of person,
Mhm.
that I'm going to do things differently. And I had like a weird upbringing in different cultures and all of that, which certainly helped as resources. And I think from people come in feeling like, oh, like I don't feel happy with my type, or I feel something's wrong with me, or whatever it is. I'm like, you have a lot of resources. Even the person who's grown up in the same small town all of their lives, they'd probably be surprised to realize how many more resources they have than they
Mhm.
thought they did.
Mhm.
But yeah, people have a different stack, and we could say, because it's a psychometric assessment, it's not brain imaging, we could say, well, the person just doesn't know themselves clearly. They're mistaken.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, that's something we can say, but is it really that tens of thousands of people are mistaken, deeply mistaken about themselves, or do they just live different lives?
Mhm.
And they have different skills and different life history. I mean, it always amazes me when I think back to like young ENTPs, for example, that I've met, to bring in another type.
Mhm.
Um, Especially male ENTP, often poor listening skills. Like, sorry guys, if you're an ENTP listening, like this is just a thing, especially male ENTPs, poor listening skills, maybe don't even process social feedback clues at all. But then there are ENTPs who become therapists, who become salesmen or saleswomen. You know, they're on the phone. They have to learn how to listen in a different way.
Mhm.
They really take parenting seriously, and they begin to pay attention to all of the clues that their kids are giving them.
Mhm.
and they develop different skills. And that's what the brain imaging highlights, is this is really the case. This is true. And it correlates very well with career for people over 25. But just having this very simple self-assessment. And I'm like, no, I believe a lot of people are doing their best effort to report their skillful use. And I think this is great, because if you're an INFP and you feel like, gee, I would like to be better at business or something like that, I'm like, you know what? There are other INFPs who are really good at business, and they're also a resource that's out there, and they already figured out to do TE in a businessy way. And that moved up in their formation of their self, like their everyday self, like they're putting that skill out there. And that means that we're a lot more adaptable than maybe we would think. Not every INFP is dreamy novelist or theater performer or something like that. That really every type appears in every profession. And it doesn't mean it's easy to do all of those things, but they can step up. So I just want people to know that I don't think it's because we don't know ourselves very well or whatever it is. It's that our environment really does play a big role.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I know a lot of INFPs have commented on my videos of like, I took the test or the assessment. I'm an INFP. Oh no. Like, what do I do now? Like, I got the diagnosis that I'm an INFP. And, and I think, as you said, we all have so many more resources than we know. And even just your personality type itself is an awesome resource. And leaning into that more is extremely helpful. But it starts with awareness. And then it starts with, then you got to get over some of those obstacles. And you can do that through finding the resources and collapsing on the obstacles and using them to combat the obstacles, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. You describe it in a very dramatic way. That's nice, like a heroic way. Combat the obstacles.
Combat the obstacles. Yes.
Yeah. And when a person, if they sort of get like a result, a stack that's not maybe what they expected or wondering why, I'm like, just go back to the questions. Like, you rated something as a 6 that was, say, extroverted sensing. How did you interpret that question? And the extroverted sensing questions are like pretty obviously extroverted sensing questions, and you rated it highly. So what's going on? It's not like we pulled the results out of a hat. Like, it's you in the mirror describing yourself, and this is what you came up with. But the fact that there are these very clear statistical clusters where we're talking about something like whether it's 14% or 23% or whatever of INFPs say, yes, like there's this very consistent stack that's there. And I'm not going to say that there's secretly like more types or subtypes, but because everybody, really can turn out differently. But to really acknowledge that development is a part of it. And then the results are not like this magical thing that's handed to you. You're in this school in Hogwarts, this house. But it becomes a point to reflect upon and then maybe say yes, and if a person doesn't, sort of despairs, oh, I came at INFP, and then they open the book and they start reading the description and they're like, yeah, I am a lot like this. And, it's, what is it? It's not just it's like the tormented soul or whatever it is. I'm like, no, not necessarily. Like, let's just go back to like how you scored, and let's talk about your life and your culture and the resources you have. And that's and is it likely that like say introverted thinking is way down and the stack? Yes, it's very likely that it is. So the general descriptions aren't wrong, but they are very general.
Okay. Cool. So what should we talk about next?
Sorry. Yeah, it's a good question. We can dig in a little bit to the data here, and I can talk about the sort of 4 versions of the 4 classes of use statistics language there of dominant introverted feeling types. And it's certainly possible that some listeners have identified as INFP or told they were typed or profiled as INFP, but might actually be ISFPs, for example, or vice versa. They're like, well, you're a farmer, so you must be an ISFP instead of an INFP, because no INFP would ever be a farmer. Or truck drivers. I know an INFP truck driver. I mean, the
I think
occasional,
I do
among
too.
many other things.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. But when you hear, you ask them and interview them and you get into the details, they're like, okay, they're not like your standard issue truck driver. Like what led to them in their life
Mhm.
to be that way. So one thing that pops out is there is this version of INFP that, yes, follows the I'm not going to say like the classic function stack, but it follows what we really expect to see. That like fits INFP very well. So like feeling in general is well developed. Introverted feeling in particular. They also have developed some extroverted feeling because they're a little bit more expressive and social. They can be. And the intuiting side is there, and the playful brainstorming, extroverted intuiting is there. And they also have decent introverted intuiting, which I've encountered a lot with INFPs. When it comes to something like shamanic drum journey, or even the number of INFPs I've encountered in the psychedelic community, or are involved in some kind of body mind practice, or
Yeah.
religious practice, spiritual practice, and it's not like, oh no, they're not doing NI at all. And if they think they are, they're just kidding themselves. I'm like, no, like they're using introverted intuiting too,
Mhm.
um, as well as I would. Probably not, because that's my dominant function.
Mhm.
But they're using it in a way that is skillful, and is meeting their needs. And for INFPs, introverted intuiting is sometimes described by John Beebe and others as like the Senex or witch, and it's like it
Right.
like it's like a defensive kind of thing, and it's like a stormtrooper in a way. And I'm like, but it can also be the doorway to wisdom
Yeah.
when it's integrated into a person's life. And when I meet an INFP that does introverted intuiting pretty well, then what we see is this balance. It's not just ideas that are out there and playing with those. They also have an element of like a vision for themselves or
Mhm.
about themselves. That doesn't mean like they're like, we're going to the stars and like these are the 10 things we're going to do to get there. But it doesn't need to be that way. But there's this clarity of also, of course, the dominant function always being present. Like this needs to be important,
Mhm.
but there is this ability to envision something for themselves and like work toward it clearly, and get there, and not just in some random, I don't even know how I'm going to get there. It's like, no, there's like, I actually have a vision,
Mhm.
and there is something that's there. Or they just engage in these spiritual practices, which is more how Jung described it anyway, and artistic aesthetic practices
Right.
that that really like enrich their type in a deep way. And that's lovely. And then for this type also, or this class of INFP, to be in touch with feeling enough, feeling in general as a function. And Jung made it very clear that there are 4 functions,
Yeah.
and each one of them can express in 2 different ways. And as we develop, it's sort of like branches of a tree.
Mhm.
And we really just focus, okay, we have feeling, we're starting to develop feeling, you're a feeling type. And then you go in that direction for INFP of really focusing on introverted feeling. But when the extroverted feeling is also there, it's not just about me, my, mine. It's about compassion and what is good for other people, and paying attention to other people's needs and values in the group or in their family or whatever it is.
Mhm.
INFP is not just like blindly going along, oh, I go wherever my feelings lead me. I mean, there are some who are like that, I suppose, but a lot of them I find are actually quite attentive to what's going on to other people, and not just out of curiosity, but really have brought into themselves this desire to be at peace with the people around them,
Mhm.
and for those people to also be at peace, and to be able to help the world and other people, and to acknowledge that people have different values and different needs. And for the INFP to say at times, you know what, this is not what I want to do, but my spouse or my child or whatever, this project, this team needs this. and I'm going to step up,
Mm.
and I'm going to pay attention to that.
Mhm.
Does that make them, say, an ENFJ? No. But there is this, like, there in their social skills that, as you described, like, once we acknowledge something is important, then we begin to actually engage with it and build that relationship, and we become better at it.
Mhm.
And the person can really feel like the INFP feels to others, like, yeah, no, they do like some extroverted feeling, and when they do it pretty well.
Mm.
And that's and we can try and fit that into like a really tight theory, but that's not describing every INFP that's out there.
Yeah.
That's just like group that's there. Now, the disadvantage, on the other hand, for this class of INFP is that sensing and thinking tend to be further down. So when you've already filled up the top of the stack with these things, there's other stuff that's just going to fall further down bottom of the stack.
Mhm.
And probably that same INFP is going to have challenges with all of the sensing and thinking functions to some extent. And
Mhm.
that's, yeah, they're just very NF. They're just very intuiting feeling. And then the other side of it is like, wow, these other things are really a challenge.
Mhm.
This is the class of INFP that when, say, they take the MBTI assessment, which is just looking at preferences, like, are you more S or N, more F or T? They are going to pretty clearly come out as intuiting and feeling.
Mm.
And that part is not unclear to them at all. Maybe the other dimensions are like, no, I'm like actually pretty social and attentive to people. So I don't know, and a lot of INFPs I've met have wondered at times, like, well, I feel there are days when I'm definitely more ENFP like.
Yeah.
And then there are even the INFPs who are like, am I INFP or INFJ?
Yeah.
So this is the class of INFP that really wonders, am I INFP or INFJ?
Yeah, that comes up very often as well.
Yeah.
Just type
Yeah.
confusion between those, specifically those two that you mentioned. The extroverted
Yeah.
ENFP, INFP, and INFJ, INFP. Um, okay, but generally,
Yes,
is
that's one
there?
class.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
I often think of like the cognitive functions and this whole thing as like a game, like an RPG, and you have a bunch of skill trees, and you're putting points into specific directions of the skill tree. But then that means that obviously you can't put them in every place. And so there's the cost of specialization as you start to go more and more down the, let's say, feeling tree. Maybe you put a lot of points in FI and FE, but then that just means that
Mhm.
there's less for T and thinking.
Yeah.
And okay. So what's
Yeah.
the other type like?
So the other class of INFP is actually quite good at the thinking function, especially extroverted thinking. And they're definitely more of what we would think of as like an adaptation. Um, Many societies, certainly Western society, certainly American society, promote certain functions culturally.
Mhm.
Mostly extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing are two very top up there. If you're going and working in organizations, in fact, the whole school system, really promotes from, age 5 to 18, typically, you got to learn how to do extroverted thinking. And you go into the workplace and everybody else is doing extroverted thinking. Your boss, even maybe they're not even a TJ type, they're also doing extroverted thinking. Moreover, if you're a male INFP, you're going to be getting this message that says, especially younger, like teenage or young 20s, like, oh, you're a dude. Like, aren't you doing extroverted thinking? That's sort of like that there's a certain element of like distance and like being in control of things and like
Mhm.
having a plan. And I mean, I'm stereotyping, but that's there's this social pressure, this cultural pressure or norm. Aren't you be the one who like makes the plans for the evening and like knows what you're doing and has quick answers to things? Um, and yeah, there usually with this version, there's an introverted sensing is also something that they lean on pretty hard
Okay.
because that's the other function that is socially encouraged very much in many societies, certainly Western society. Obviously, in Japanese society, SI is like, yeah, it's just so, yeah, it's tokubetsu. And this when we look at it, we see that this INFP has really leaned hard into their opposite type. To sum it up, that they have really leaned into ISTJ and ESTJ and bringing those functions out and operating with those and trying to get skillful use of those. And what ends up suffering is not their introverted feeling, because that's still top, but what does sort of suffer along the way is, say, extroverted feeling, because they're like, oh, well, I'm not supposed to behave that way, and that's not how companies behave, and so on. And then weirdly, it's their second function is the extroverted intuiting. It's like, oh, well, that, they get this feedback over the years from their family or school or the workplace or all three of those, whatever it is. Like, oh, you're just being ridiculous. You're just living in your head, daydreaming. That metaphor, like, what is that? We don't know what to do with that metaphor. And so they do know how to use it, but they don't get to use it very often. And probably because they're not using it very often, they're really not getting the benefit of it. And it goes back to what Antonia Dodge, a personality hacker, advises, and I think it's true for everybody, but in particular, this class of INFP is like, circle back to your second function.
Yeah.
Remember, the second function is this really great resource, and even if other people aren't liking how it shows up, the calling is to find a way to allow it to show up that actually it participates in the magic. And if there's any second function that knows how to bring magic to a situation, it's extroverted intuiting. So that is that version that is, the first one, that first class is very idealistic. And then there's this other version that probably will not even score as INFP. Like, as they dig into type, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I can see, especially the introverted feeling is quite strong. But then they're so well adapted to society and their job and their family and culture that they've just really anchored a lot in their opposite type.
I've definitely seen a lot of both of those within the INFP communities that I run. I'm thinking, if somebody's listening right now, they might feel that if they are that second kind of INFP who has leaned more into SI and TE, does that make them unhealthy, or is there some other way of wording it or focusing on it that is, more inspirational? Because I can see them as strengths and resources.
So I used to have the attitude that the classic function stack was like the healthiest expression. I don't really think that now, because each function can show up in a more or less healthy way. All of the functions within each of us. And a great example, I can give several examples. One of them is, say, with extroverted thinking. That's the inferior function, as it's called. There's some other people who use some other language, like Dr. Linda Behrens, that it's the aspirational function. It can be inferior, but it also represents a lot of aspirations that the person has. And when we look at the life of, say, Isabel Myers, who is INFP, and it's so funny because Isabel Myers herself didn't actually recognize, or at least, officially, in statements, she's like, oh, I felt like I never really integrated my inferior function. And I'm just sort of like, yes, you did. Very much so. Because what did she do? She spent decades, and I say the decades part, sticking with it, so there's some introverted sensing there. But the extroverted thinking, developing an objective psychometric assessment and a giant worldwide organization. I don't know, which function does that sound like? And process for how to debrief people and what's the best ways to find best fit type and all of that. Building relationships with the organizations that make sure that it's going to succeed and is going to last. And I'm like, that would make a lot of ESTJs pretty proud. Like, dude, to say at the end of your life, you built a worldwide organization and legacy using an objective assessment to make that happen.
Yeah.
and a whole business out of it. Of course, there's that element too. And I'm like, of course you did. Like, you very much did extroverted thinking. Maybe not while she's cooking, but
Mm.
or relaxing at home, enjoying a story. Uh, but it's there. So if a person say, the extroverted thinking is higher, my question to them is, do you feel like you're doing it in a way that's just meeting the demands of other people and feels authentic and is actually sabotaging you in your life? Or is it actually integrated into your life in a way? And I believe this, and I feel I can say this now that I qualify for senior citizen discounts at Denny's, for those of in
Congratulations.
America.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. That doesn't mean I'm 65, by the way. It's 55 at Denny's.
Nice.
Um, that your fourth function can become, when well integrated, the foundation of the personality.
Mm.
And I mean that, like, if you build a house, the interesting part of the house that you live in is not the foundation,
Hmm.
but your house is definitely going to be in rough shape for anything that comes along if your house does not have a foundation. And not only that, that foundation is where everything grows off of. And as Isabel Myers and those in her sort of her cohort described when they created like this little icon, like this little stick person, as they called it, your dominant function is your head,
Mm.
and your second and third function are your hands. And your fourth function, your so-called inferior function, is actually your feet
Yeah.
that takes you somewhere. You can think anything you want in your head, but to actually go somewhere in life, you need your feet.
Yeah.
And so it really is looking at as like, then it's a simple question of like, how well integrated is it? And for folks with introverted feeling is like, how happy are you in your life? And how happy are you when you're using this function?
Hmm.
And I can definitely say that there are some INFPs who are like, they're stoked to be using extroverted thinking in the way that they are. And then there are others who really feel like, I just feel like I'm forced to show up for other people in a way that's completely fake.
Yeah.
So it becomes then we have to dig a little deeper. And that's where we remember that the 8-function model was developed as a therapeutic tool, not as Jung called it, a parlor game to type people.
Yeah. Mm. That's great. I loved the visual metaphor that you used for that. I was thinking, TE is there serving FI, right? FI has the drive in Isabel Myers, you know, to help everybody see that individual aspect of themselves, get to understand themselves more. But we need TE to help structure that. And I've definitely
Mhm.
noticed that in my life, as well as with many of the INFPs that I've coached and talked to, is having the vision or having the thing that you want to bring into the world, or you just want to be this kind of person in the world, is great. But also there are mechanical, technical things that you need to do, and leaning into TE is the way that you can do those and make that FI drive emerge in the way that you want. But
Yeah.
without it, you're going to be struggling and not have the resources to live the kind of life that you want to live.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And the deep challenge that's there for INFPs, which would be like extroverted sensing and introverted thinking, for like almost all INFPs across the board when they come out in the results, those are still not in the top 4. Like, those are always going to be challenge areas.
Hmm.
That said, uh, if we take a function that's supposed to be last, so that's introverted thinking. John Beebe was asked a few years ago to talk about, like, what is the relationship between the first and the 8th function? And he disappeared for a couple of years and said, I'm working on it. And then he came back and came up with some really, really good stuff
Yeah.
that dips back into Jung's work. Because Jung talked about other functions, by the way. He said there's this category of functions called mental functions that's like thinking and feeling and sensing, intuiting. But there are also other functions like the unity function, the religious function, the aesthetic
Mm-hmm.
function. Most people in type have never heard of these before.
Mm-hmm.
But Beebe said that something that introverted feeling and introverted thinking have in common is they're both the philosophical function. They're two very different ways of going about trying to answer this like fundamental challenge in life, this fundamental task, which is, what is my philosophy of life, the universe, and everything?
Mm.
In a very profound way. And the TI person is going to go for that like physics model of the universe in a way. And the FI person is going to go for that Kierkegaard existential path of like, it's not like, what are the physics? It's like, where am I in all of this? Whereas the TI person is like, I want to know the universe without considering all of my personal baggage as like a block to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is that in common. And I really love the work of Walter Lowen from the 80s. And he defined the functions, their roles. He actually talked about roles even before BB was thinking about roles, but in a different way. Like he came as an engineer. And he really saw the eighth function as, which would be introverted thinking for INFP, as the servant. He used the word slave, but let's say servant is a little bit nicer term, of the dominant function. And I gotta say it's true. Is my own eighth function. I use it, but I only ever use it in a way that must absolutely meet the needs of the dominant function. And the moment it doesn't do that, it's like, you be quiet and go out of the room. And I think this explains, yes, the INFP likes to delve into different ideas, and type is an idea, and like this really big, interesting idea, and it's about people and so on. But type is also a theoretical framework that is not this personal story of myself. Like it's this very impersonal thing in a way. And yet many INFPs actually can really like get to like the chapter and verse level of type, because they are doing, I believe, introverted thinking about their very favorite important topic. And the moment, as long as that introverted thinking is meeting the needs of their dominant function, who am I? Who are you? What is life about? What is the meaning of these things? They want to learn all of it and get it right. And there's even some introverted sensing coming in there. And then there's all this other TI stuff, like finding leverage in situations in order to take advantage of others, where INFP is like, nope, nope, that's no interest to me whatsoever. In fact, that's just wrong, and like that's evil, and I'm not even going to go down that path. And I think some very relevant everyday things, like INFP's relationship to money, because the whole money system is a very thinking thing. And there are people with introverted thinking who really excel at it because they just stand back and they don't consider the morals or ethics of money. They're just like, how do you use money to make more money? And that's very basic, and like, what are the strategies and tactics around that? And INFP is going to say probably no to that. And if they say yes to money and they start to develop a good relationship with it, it's because it met the need of the dominant function, introverted feeling, to be like, what if we ran a nonprofit that was able to help all of these people? And in order to have a successful nonprofit that isn't just wasting a bunch of money and whatever, that really we have integrity, that 90% of what we raise actually goes to the people we want to help, then they're going to be like, let me dig into how to use money to make money. And they develop a different relationship with it. So I say anybody can develop a relationship, even when it's all the way down the stack and it's like the shortest bar in the assessment results. And I'm like, you can develop a positive relationship with that function. And you can be, will that servant in your house ever be your sweetheart? Probably not. And if it is, that will be quite destructive, probably, and much worse than the worst Downton Abbey episode where something terrible happens. But we can have a good relationship with that servant. And so I would say even then, like, don't take even your own individual stack too seriously, that just because it's last or second to last doesn't mean it's like, oh, I'm hopeless with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, they're all advisors sitting at that big round table
Yeah.
in a situation room, and you're just like, well, what's your perspective on this? What's yours? And probably don't talk to TI too much, but when we do, there's hopefully good advice that comes from there, or there's probably good advice, but it's a matter of, do we bring it in and accept it as this is something that is okay and that's going to serve and help in the way that I want to do my life.
Yeah. So that's the gist of it, and that's for one type, and there are 15 other types, and we have tentative results for all of those. And I think I can wrap up with this by saying, Mina Barmani, who's the one actually leading the analysis part of it, although we actually have a third person who's the disinterested party performing the statistics, because that's like what a good journal wants to see. And she's a little bit worried, and I'm a little bit worried at first, like, oh, the Myers-Briggs community is not going to be pleased to see that, yes, these 8 functions are distinct functions, but it doesn't follow the standard order. And I'm like, why don't we just ask AI to take these profiles and generate some sample people with names and careers and whatever, use all of its knowledge about type. And we did that. And I'm like, and as I'm reading through them, I'm like, both of these INFPs, they sound like INFPs. They're just different, but they still sound like INFPs. So I don't, for those who are sort of theory purists, I would say that we are organic living systems. And if anybody has stepped out into the woods, or even it's springtime now where I am, I cannot believe how fast the weeds in the side yard grew in just a few weeks. Like, astonishing. They grew really fast. We are all organic beings. We're messy. And this idea that we can bring like this sweet little geometric pattern and impose it and say that everybody is like this, I'm like, that's math. And human beings are not math. That we're biology, and biology is always weird and messy, and the brain, like the different regions of the brain and what they do what and where and how, like that's all the result of evolution, of development, not of something like boop, like it's going to be this exact geometry.
Yeah.
Like, that's not it. So it's like, no, the beauty of the garden is there, and just like you grew in a different way than some other person. You're both oak trees, but you just grew in very different ways.
INFPs will definitely appreciate that perspective on personality type. Cool.
Yeah. I think it's a type that I feel naturally appreciates the diversity there.
Awesome. Yeah. Are there any resources or links or anything like that you want to share?
For this particular thing, it's I know that Mina Barmani is doing a presentation for the Association for Psychological Type on this topic, but that is later in the year. We don't have anything published on this round of analysis. The previous round, which had half as many people, that is published. It is in the back of a couple of books. There's like, I'm pretty sure even in Decode Your Personality, which is more recent, and I'm not necessarily one to, I mean, it's in the Magic Diamond, I know that. So this is a problem with being a dominant perceiving type, which is me. I write something and I don't even know what's in it or where it is. 383. And folks can get these on Amazon, and they can get the, like the electronic version that's not expensive, and yeah. So there's some talk about, like, they can take the assessment in the back, so I have to go online for it. And then there's a little section that sort of like directs you to where to go. But there is, I think it's more in the Magic Diamond that has a whole chapter, or appendix actually, that explains the statistics and like what we got out of it, and that there really is like 2 versions of each type.
Okay.
And not in like a hard and fast way, because one of them is more classic and the other one is more just like, yeah, whatever. But they make sense culturally.
Mm.
And I think that's cool. Like that's if that can help people find themselves better and make better choices in their lives, then that's the best thing. Yeah, I know it's in the appendix of the Magic Diamond,
Okay.
and that there's some talks and stuff about it that go into more like give the actual alpha values and stuff.
Mm.
And anybody's also free to just like email me and ask for that paper, and it's like sitting in my little folder that's like PDFs to share with people.
Okay.
I have such a folder because people email me for those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. Um, One last question that just came to mind. I don't know if it's a short question or not, but where do you imagine or where do you see type as a whole going when we had the strict function stacks that we were working
Mhm.
towards, and now there's more variation? Do you think the community as a whole is willing to embrace that, or do you think we'll need to bring in some other uh, mental models or frameworks or different ways of visualizing it, or is it just like we'll see as the garden as the garden
I
grows?
think some of it is we'll see. I think some of it is because this paper is being developed for and I think really destined for a peer review personality psychology journal,
Mhm.
that it will allow not MBTI but Jung's original framework of 8 functions um, to have a lot more academic acceptance, because then we
Mhm.
can always point to this paper, and is really tough to run a study that has several 100,000 people in it. So it's not like, oh, we only had 5,000 people or 500 people. It's like, no, we had a really big sample size. Um, so for whatever, like confounding factors that are there, like a lot of those get washed out. It's funny, the people that I've mentioned it to, including some people who were also on the web, like Joyce Mang,
Mhm.
she's like, these people in general have expressed it's a relief, actually.
Yeah.
They're relieved to see these results because they're like, I really felt this was the case all along. And I just felt like I couldn't say anything because that was stepping outside the orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm missing something, or I'm just not falling into line, or I started developing my own like model on the side.
Mm.
And so even though I say like, oh, I think a lot of people will be unhappy with it or shocked or whatever, everybody I've mentioned it to actually is like
Mhm.
pretty relieved. And I would use that word.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's going to allow also will also help people. I hope, type is like this little like you're going into the entryway of this amazing mansion, and many people never get out of the entryway, or they go into the parlor and they learn about type and depth as a guest. But Jung, this is like one chapter in one book. And even then, he said he even went back and thought he was going to reissue the book and take out the chapter on the types. Because he's like, people keep looking at this, and this is not what I want them to look at or to
Mm.
focus on. Is like, I want them to focus on this concept of one-sidedness.
Yeah.
And this is simply a language to talk about one-sidedness. And then the therapeutic approach to how do you help people with one-sidedness. Um, and if it can really help people get more into Jung, then I think that will be like a beautiful advancement.
I agree. Awesome. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, good. Is there anything else? No?
No,
Cool.
no,
All right.
no.
Well, thank you very much for joining, for talking for an hour about these new type discoveries and how INFPs specifically can understand themselves more and feel more at peace with the different variations of their personality type. I'm sure everybody will enjoy that too. And I'll put the links that you mentioned to the diamond. I'm sorry, the Magic Diamond book,
The Magic Diamond. Yes.
as well as your email address or your website, if that works for you, and then people
Mhm.
can contact you from there. All right.
Perfect. Thank you for having me on again. I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
どうも。じゃあね、ありがとう。